Hi, and welcome to the Org Dev podcast. So what does it take to do organisation development in the heart of central government? So we're absolutely delighted to be joined by Dr. Susanne Sondergaard Gidda, who leads the Civil Service Operating Lead as part of her current role in the Cabinet Office. She has a master's degree in occupational psychology and a PhD in organisational psychology, and is also a chartered fellow of the CIPD. In addition to experience working in a number of government departments, she's previously worked for Rolls-Royce as a knowledge management specialist, leading on communities of practice, which is fascinating, and also as a senior policy analyst with RAND Europe, which is a non-profit global policy think tank and research institute. On top of what could only be described as an extremely busy and engaging role, she consistently makes time to support the OD profession through her work with the CIPD. And she also regularly conducts fascinating research. Now, full disclosure, we're big fans of Susanne. In fact, we both presented, didn't we, Danny, with Susanne at the CIPD Change Management Conference. And Susanne gave a fascinating case study about reconsidering management spans of control and how they can be used to improve productivity and performance. And it really provoked some great thinking and challenged our assumptions about the role of leaders in supporting people. Now, I was doing some research as well, Susanne, and I also found some really fascinating reports online. You did a really interesting one on complex decision-making as well. So there's lots of interesting things for us to talk about, but it really is just such a delight to have such a brilliant, generous and engaging guest join us today. So welcome, Susanne.
So just to kick us off, just tell us a bit about the role that you do and what does that involve?
Yeah, so I've recently picked up a new role in the Cabinet Office, so in the UK Civil Service. So it's a role sitting as part of the Civil Service Strategy Unit that looks across what the civil service needs to deliver for the future and how we both ensure we've got the right capability, the right structures in the organizations to enable that to happen. And that's looking across all the different aspects of the civil service operating model, everything from ensuring the vision strategy is in there, but all the way to culture, processes, people, data, infrastructure, etc. So how do we make sure that the civil service in the UK is set up to deliver its value for the public?
And what might surprise people about working in the Cabinet Office? What might they not expect?
Oh, it depends on what people expect the civil service is. So I think depending on whether or not you take the negative views that we're a bunch of bureaucrats sitting talking to ourselves about things that don't matter, or if we think about really how do we draw on the evidence that's available in and outside government, in the private sector, from international aspects. So how do we make sure it's a really strong evidence base that our decisions are made of? How do we make sure that the relationship between us, the public, the ministerial team is set up in the right way, but also that it's a really passionate organization. I think there's something about we've got people who are committed to making things work and who are committed to making a difference. So I don't know if that answers, but it depends on what you think the Cabinet Office is doing and whether or not you think the Cabinet Office is or is not doing that. So you may be surprised that we are evidence-based, or you may say, actually, I assumed that was the case because you are using public money to deliver effects for the public.
But yeah, I think it starts to give people a flavour of what it's like. And in terms of organisation development, what does that look like in your context? What does it involve doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of that. So again, I know you've on previous podcasts been talking about organisation design, organisation development. I'd say we're sort of in the middle of both of those two things. So there are things that we need to develop in the way that the civil service system operates, which could be about improving our existing relationships between different functions, or it could be about improving relationships within departments, or working with OD&D teams across government to do that. But it could also be about, are we set up in the right way? And that could include the work that Garen talked about earlier around organizational spans and layers. What does that mean in terms of structure and itself, but also what does it mean in terms of our culture and the behaviors and the values that we support across government?
And this is at real scale, though, isn't it? So when you're sort of saying we're supporting some other OD teams, though, some of these might be like the Department of Work and Pensions. That's over 75,000 employees, multiple locations across the UK. And that's just one department, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So the civil service is a huge system, obviously, with about 500,000 people working in the civil service at the moment. And each of them, so the civil service, for those who don't know, we've got delegated authorities, so departments can run their organizations in the way that they deem are necessary to do it. There will be links back into what we call in the centre of government, and there'll be expectations from Treasury on how we manage our public funds. But the perm secs of those departments are responsible for the way that their organizations operate. So when we support the teams within those departments, so in my previous role, developing their capabilities and supporting the kind of challenges, supporting them to meet the challenges they've got in their departments, we've got the potential impact of 500,000 people across the civil service, and then ultimately what the services that they deliver out to 65 million people in the UK. So yes, it's a huge scale. So it's a privilege, and it's I think the only way to approach is with the humility that if I can make one small change in that system for the better, I'd be very happy if I could do that. But obviously, big ambitions on how can we make that more long-term sustainable change.
And why is OD so important to the context you're working in? Why do you feel it's so important?
I mean, I think OD is important in any context. So I've come from a psychology background, always been fascinated in how people work, and we spent a lot of time at work. And I think there is a huge potential for that experience to be as positive for those who are operating within, because I think it leads to better work. It leads to work being done at a higher quality, people being more engaged and motivated by having an impact on hopefully the area that they're working in, that they're more skilled to do that, but also that the organization has a business sense of saying actually that investment is worth doing because we know that it's going to, in the long run, make it better. So I know we're not a commercial organization, but it doesn't mean that we don't cost money. So clearly making sure that the way we do things are done to high quality and done with the rest of resources we got available. So, and I think OD can add huge value there. And if we think about the way that OD draws on really good behavioral science to influence how systems work. So I've always been fascinated, but people at work, how we behave, how groups interact at work, how you can shift things. And I've experienced work environments that have not been good, and I've experienced in a work environment that are great, and the difference that it has on me as an individual is huge. So what I can do from an OD perspective to make that a consistently positive experience for people at work, I think it is fascinating. There are other professions and professionals who can do this, and obviously I'd say the OD, what do we set it apart, is probably some of our values and the approach that we take to the work.
You mentioned just about because you're very new into your new role, and we're always really curious to ask questions to me about how do you begin, like how do you get the task framed, how do you get informed consent from those around you about, so that people's expectations are clear and understood as well.
I think there's always that experience of working as a consultant that have been brought in with a particular requirement that an organization or a unit has experienced, and you come in and are brought into that discussion rather than being added into a role that's in an existing team. So there's something about the team already. We're looking at some of these things. So a lot of that work on understanding what is the requirement for what we do? Do we understand what the scope is for what we don't? Do we understand where the boundaries and lines are for where we engage and where we don't engage? And do we understand the relationships between other parts? So we're obviously part of a much larger unit that looks at other parts of the civil service, and wanting to make sure that we understand what those units are delivering and how we fit into their work and how their work fits into us. So I'd say similar to what you might do when you're doing your consultancy work, the scoping discovery phase on where do we fit in, what's already been taking place, what's already planned that you need to continue, or planned that you are thinking, I think we want to go a different way. And then there is so that's the starting. That would be my starting point. So where we come from, what's the work that's already taken us to where we are today, and what are the expectations then on the people that we're working with. So for me in this sort of 3-4 weeks into my role is getting to know the key players in the field and making sure I understand where they're coming from, so that whatever we do, I have got a way and a relationship to work with them and co-design the work that we're going to be doing, because this is going to be absolutely essential for us to achieve any significant long-term impact, is that it's a co-creation with a wider system, which is optimistic when you've got that many people in the system, but how do you decide where you're going to get most out of engaging and where they are more likely to have that energy to support the work. So getting those relationships and building up that network for me and drawing on the back. That's probably my starting point. I've been spending a lot of time reading previous reports, where we come from, what's the earlier engagement, and set up a working group as well, understanding with stakeholders, how do we bring everyone together on this journey.
Your previous role is about sort of capability development, and obviously you'll be working with lots of different teams, different levels of, they'll be around different lengths of time, different levels of maturity and whatnot. So how do you go about identifying the capabilities that you need to develop? Is there a process that you follow, or like, how do you go about doing that?
Tricky. So in my previous role, there were two different elements of it. So thinking about, do we understand the capability the civil service has in OD&D in the first instance, and do we understand what the capability is that we need? And I think for any leader or capability lead, you'd always want to keep both those in your mind as you're working through it. So if you look at the assessment for how do you assess what capability we've got in OD&D, we actually didn't have a good way of approaching that, and there are not that many, I want to say, good capability assessment tools in our space to give us that very clear-cut understanding of it. So we drew on some of the work that CIPD have been doing on some of the expectations for an HR in the HR community or people profession that you would draw on to be an OD&D practitioner, or different levels of expertise, and we drew on some of the work that Dr. Mian Chung Judge did on developing her OD app on those different specialist areas to see where does that fit. And we then had colleagues in from a consultancy to do a piece of work on how do we map out the capabilities that's required to be effective. And some of the bits there around what are some of the challenges that we are working on at the moment, and which capabilities are most suited to meet those challenges, so we could prioritize those in the immediate one. And then the next bit would be, what do we think is coming around the corner, and what capabilities do we need to get there? So there were some assumptions we had to make around what does it mean to be good, and what does it mean to really stretch our ambition in the OD&D space. In terms of developing that capability, our approach was doing it at different levels. So clearly there's something for what do we do for individuals. So how do we make sure that individuals have got access, well, in the first instance, have awareness that there is such thing as OD&D and that it's something worth investing in. So how do we create that awareness across a wider community? So it's not an accident whether or not you find OD&D, and it's not limited to a very small exclusive group, but there is a more broader access, inclusive access to OD&D, and knowing the difference it will make and how it might fit into careers path. Then it was around making sure that appropriate L&D were available to learning and development for those individuals, could be accessed through our government learning frameworks. The second bit was around how do we ensure that we then continue that growth. And we knew that some of our more experienced practitioners or expert practitioners really preferred a more individualized support, so that they could pick and choose when they're able to engage or disengage with learning opportunities. So putting in place a number of sort of diverse approach to learning and development, and that went everything from a monthly book club discussion, could be a podcast, could be articles or movies or anything else that had an OD and angle into it. How do we make sure that we draw that in to people's capability development? And that was based on people's interest in having peers to discuss with on OD&D, and finding that during their normal day, I don't know if you recognize this as well, there's not always time to just pick up and read that extra journal or pick up that extra book that you've been lying on your desk for a long time. So, but if we had a meeting set in place for it, where we could talk through a number of themes that came out of it, actually a lot more people would be coming in and saying, actually, I took up that article, I read it, and I found that a lot of people, even if they couldn't make the actual discussing, would still be picking up the learning. But that was being more engaged if and when. And then a wider community base also on action learning set. So how do you have conversations with peers around OD&D challenges and how we bring them forward? We put in place a piece of work looking at supervision and the role of supervision. So how do we support and supervise, both from a sort of formative but also normative approach, the work that we did in OD&D, so that we can ensure that we have people who continue to develop. So with OD&D, I find that there's always the next step. I always find so humble that there are so many things I don't know, and the more I read, there are more things I don't know about in the OD&D space. So how do we make sure we continue on that journey, that we don't just stop and grow stagnant in the OD&D space? So yeah, we try to do different things, putting in the formalized learning, but also putting in things that supported peer and individual learning and in groups.
This many organization development people at scale, these are autonomous, smart people who are very busy. It must feel like herding cats as well.
They are brilliant. They're absolute brilliant.
Absolutely.
But you're right. And again, some departments would have a lot of that work done within their own departments because they would be big enough to do it. But a lot of departments, the OD and PD practitioner might also be the cultural lead and might also be the reward lead in that particular organization. There'd only be one. So what we could do from a central perspective was provide the opportunity for colleagues across government to come together on a common purpose, as in, I'm really interested in developing my OD&D capability.
And I guess sort of segueing, because we want to ask a question about what was your journey into OD, and I imagine like your work at Rolls-Royce developing communities of practice would have been really instrumental in helping you sort of bring that together. What was your journey into OD?
So I studied to be a psychologist when I lived in Denmark, and in my master's I studied on cognitive science and social psychology. So those two different aspects on people operating as social beings, but also the internal operation and how we think and do things. And I did my practical training at a neuropsychology clinic at a hospital, where doing lots of brain damage rehabilitation and assessment. And at the neuropsychology hospital, I really found much more interesting the relationship between the medical staff and the physiotherapists and the speech therapists and the neuropsychologists and the patients and that whole system around the hospital. So I was fascinated on how can you bring that whole community around the patient and focus on what does this particular patient need, because it wasn't always the same thing that they needed. And that led me to go to the UK for what was then my intent to stay 12 months for a master's degree in occupational psychology at the Institute of Work Psychology up in Sheffield, where I could for a year go into all the aspects on how does psychology apply to work, from everything from how does it apply in human factors, in sort of industrial settings, to training and development, to recruitment, to all aspects of being at work, health and well-being, etc. So that's probably started my interest in how do you apply good behavioral science, psychology to the life at work. I then went out and joined Rolls-Royce and worked with communities of practice, which is really also about how do you improve the organizations, how do you improve the sharing of knowledge, which was my interest in my PhD, on how does a big organization share knowledge between different parts of itself, and how do you make sure you bring that back to the way you operate as a company. And since then, I've been in roles that were more related to the HR space. So really keen on understanding on how we work with HR issues. So that's in leadership and engagement, and more broadly on how do you apply some of these things in the HR space to improve the way that we work and the experience of being at work, which I think are two essential parts to do. And I then had a stint out and went to around Europe to work on policy, which made a lot of sense. And for me, it was a great move for really deepening my knowledge of how policy is made, how do you best analyze it, and how do you apply it, but also how do you engage with clients, because a lot of that work was leading projects and working with clients in the government not-for-profit sector to deliver projects in, as you found research on decision making for the General Medical Council, but also more widely in how do you build cybersecurity capability in Europe. So lots of different aspects of that, and coming back into the civil service, heightening up my leadership journey within the civil service, while last year actually going on the NCL certificate program in OD to again remind me of some of the things I need to develop, but also continue to deepen my own development and use of self, which we use a lot in the OD space.
And the NCL program is a really interesting program, isn't it? I think we talked sort of last year or this year when you were on it, and you were finding it really fascinating. What kind of things did you take away from it?
Just a real desire to do more of the group dynamic work. So how patterns are showing up in groups, but also how sometimes you see them show up in whole systems, and how you can then intervene at different levels of that system. I think it's just brilliant, and I think that opportunity to take that time to understand your own role in the wider system. So I think all of us probably think about it when we work in the systems, but the privilege and being able to step back and look at it with new eyes and go, actually, yeah, I need to know more about this area to go into this space. We also talked a lot about politics and power, a lot about sort of privilege, and lots of different things where you think the OD space, because of our values, we need to be able to work at and with diversity and inclusion, in addition to all the other things we do.
And just that final question about the group thing, because we had someone on for the Tavistock recently, and they do sort of a 10-day immersion program where it's just the full group experience and T groups. How do like NTL sort of bring the group thing to life, and what was your experience of it? They
do obviously the theoretical parts of discussion about groups, and then they do T groups, training groups as well, which is an intense series of group interventions and interactions, which is like the Fight Club. You don't talk about what happens in the T group.
I tried 5 times now to get this out of East. You're doing really well to the code. Your turn next, Danny, to drink it.
Brilliant. So one of the things we like to do on the podcast is just try and demystify OD a little bit for people. So some of the people will see it as a bit of a dark art or not really sure what it involves. So a question we like to ask is, what's a typical day or a week look like for you?
I think going back to your question about demystifying the Cabinet Office, I don't think there is a typical week. Sometimes in the role, it is not a pure OD role. So I wouldn't say I do OD all the time. So I think there is a difference between the work where I think here I'm really developing and working with the organization, and then there are bits where I'm a leader, leading and managing resources and taking things from it, doing management, doing engagement, writing notes, papers. I think the bit where the OD comes in is where I'm intentionally making an intervention for a difference, and sometimes I do that quite visibly, and if it's with the team, I do it quite visibly and explain how I'm doing it and ask them also to do the same, because I think there's something about us collectively grow our OD expertise at the same time. I don't think there is a typical week. I'm not sure. Trying to demystify OD, so anything that has to do with understanding the organization and understanding the impact that you can have on the organization, either directly or through different routes, is probably the way I describe and demystify OD. And sometimes that means you get to know and talk to people and understand what the organization is that you're working with and how they're working. And other times it's around trying to make sense of collectively what is it we've seen and what do we think is happening. So I think it's operating at those 2 levels.
What do you enjoy most about your role or roles?
Gosh, anything that has the potential for positive impact is really powerful. I think that's probably the thing that drives me most in the work, that if there is a way in which I can make a difference in a positive, long-term, sustainable way, that really drives me. The other bit is the privilege of being able to be part of and engage with so many different parts of government, and the privilege of being led into other people's work environments. That's and just the willing and passion that people have got when they work in OD, but also those who are asking questions about OD, that they really feel that there is something that can be added to their work where OD can make a difference. I think that's really powerful, and a huge responsibility to try and keep that up.
Yeah. And what do you find most challenging?
Part of it is maintaining the reputation that every single thing that's done almost has to work, and that's not always the case. So having to accept when the interventions I do and the work I do is not having the intended impact, and still keeping the motivation up for continuing and not taking that in a personal way, but think actually that's an experiment. I tried to make that work, that didn't work, let me try something else. And then knowing when to give up and when to continue. I think there's a huge balance between that.
In terms of that kind of when to give up and when to continue, what do you look for? What are the signals that tell you?
I'm really bad at giving up. So you'd more likely than not find me sleepless going, I wonder how I'm going to crack that, than giving up. So I'm probably not the right person to ask on that. I think if there's continued no positive reaction at all, the system might not be ready for what we're doing. And speaking to other colleagues as well and testing and saying, is it something that is related to me and my capability that I'm not the right person to do it? Is it something else going on? So I think there's something around making the assessment on when is the things that's happening or not happening due to what I and the team have been doing, and when is it actually related to someone else and something else.
What's particularly interesting you in the field of OD at the moment? What's sparking your interest?
Several things. I think when we talked about this podcast, it's really around why do we know all these things about what makes good work, and we still hear lots of people not being happy at work. So I think that really interesting dilemma of, we know more about what makes good organizations and good work than we probably did 100 years ago, and why is it we are still finding that that's not a consistent experience. So that's one thing. The other bit is really around all the different ways in which you can do OD, and the skill sets and capabilities and tools and techniques that OD practitioners can draw upon. And I think that element of how do we develop and draw on different things, so that I don't want to say AI, but I am going to say AI because, and I don't mean AI from the old 50s, I'm saying the sort of generative. So how can we use now the immense computing power that we've got to do things we couldn't do before? How can we use different ways of modeling organizations and the impact of model organizations, and to predict some of the intervention we might do? And that's contradictory to what we are saying in OD, that we can't predict what's going to happen. But we can't predict what's happened, but how can we run different scenarios through and give us an indications on what some of the potential futures might look like? I think that's really exciting. I think bringing some of that futures work that other fields have been using for a long time into the field of OD, I think is really exciting. So I hope there's more happening in that space.
Brilliant. And just going back to, you said, one of the things you're pondering is why we know so much about what makes organizations work, but we're not doing all of it. Have you got a hypothesis about kind of what's going on?
It's hard. Some of it is hard, and sometimes we make it more than it is. So often people say, I want to fix this whole system, everything, everywhere, all the time, for everyone. And I go, well, sometimes we have to fix the relationship today, here and now, and that will help the system. But there's a little bit of a leap of faith to know that if I start doing some positive changes, will that make the huge difference and the work? So sometimes you might hold back for doing something because we're not fixing everything everywhere for everyone at the same time. I think in civil service we need to think about that. We can't shift the civil service for everyone tomorrow. That's not going to happen. And we see this with leaders as well outside of the civil service. You say they might have been working on something for 6 months, and then they show up on 6 months plus one and say to the team, we're doing this now. And they were like, what are we doing? And leaders go, I don't understand why you don't understand this. And they go, well, we haven't had the same time to think about it that you have. So for us, we need to do the same 6 months as you have, or maybe quicker. So I think there's something around, we think we have to fix everything at the same time. There is also lots to keep track of. There's lots of expectations you have on different fields on how to do it, and sometimes just keeping on top of what's the latest thinking in this area and what's actually the right way to do something. But sometimes we just need to do something that we think will make a better impact, and then be open for the potential that we're doing with ethical thinking and with good intent.
One of our common phrases is next step to better. So you can't fix everything, but you can certainly kind of take smaller steps that are next step to better.
We've got a bonus question for you, and you can decide whether to answer this or not. So one question we'd like to ask is, obviously there's lots of different ways, but you're still a practitioner as well. What tools or methods do you really enjoy using? So what's in the Susanne kit bag, which is like, I know it all depends, but you just like to go to and go, yeah, that's a really good tool that I like to use regularly?
For me, it's this sounds awful, but the dialogue and the conversation, collective sense making. So when we bring data together, rather than going into a dark room and shuffling out what the data is, and then it comes out the other end. So how can we collectively use that to make sense making with the people that we're working with? I think that creates both an energy, but also create a coherence in what we understand about the data, but also everyone's been part of the decision around what the data says, which sometimes unlocks a few more things rather than going back. So I don't understand where that data has come from, and you might say, well, you told me and I've just interpreted it. But there's something about how do you bring that in so that you're using that as an intervention itself.
Another optional question, you've got to pass on this one as well. Your name actually came up in a conversation that we were having the other day, surprisingly but very respectfully. A lady called Nims was talking about some work that she did with you, and she was hugely impressed with like a cultural audit or cultural inventory that you did. Just tell us something about that and how that works.
Yeah, I mean, I can't take much credit for that. So the team developed that before I joined in, but the idea was to do a cultural observatory. So how do you make sure that you do apply a methodology across the civil service to pick up what kind of cultural patterns are emerging in the system, so or rules, so how are things done here, so that you could collect all of those different rules, so to speak, and see if that tells us something about the civil service. And the idea was obviously that you've got that available and you can see from the central perspective are the things where we collectively need to intervene. So where the pattern might not show in a department but it shows up across the civil service, there's an opportunity to help shift the system, either to maintain the positive behaviors or intervene where the behaviors might not collectively be positive. So the team developed up a methodology that we then allowed other departments to use so they could use it and deploy it within their respective teams.
It kind of helps you identify the implicit and explicit rules that help govern an organization.
Yes, I mean, there's lots of discussion, and I'm sure you've got people talking about culture a bit, but in terms of, can you even measure tools? Culture, does it even make sense to talk about cultural interventions or measurements of culture? Because as soon as you're measuring it, you're shifting it. So I think a lot of it was how do you create an environment in which talking about how things are done and making them explicit and transparent makes it more able for that organization to intervene. So even the process of undertaking the audits internally would shift up and hopefully open up some conversations that they might not have had before. So even just asking that question, how do you do things around here? What kind of rules do we apply? If you can do that in a psychological safe way where people don't feel they're going to be penalized for saying things that are in the negative side, and only be encouraged to apply things in the positive side, that creates some energy in the organization.
One question that OD can sometimes find challenging is measuring the impact and success that they have. What does that look like for you in the work that you do?
A tough one. So how do you know if the civil service shifts its operating model? Is going to be the challenge for me. It's around looking for the things that, trying to measure it in as many different ways as possible. So sometimes the operating model itself is not the one to measure, but you can measure obviously whether or not the steps you've taken towards it. That usually only gives you a process sense on did I do the things I said I was going to do? But if you look back at the kind of pain points or the issues and challenges that were experienced that causes you to look at the operating model as an intervention, you would look to see if they have disappeared. So there are obviously ways in which we have picked up those pain points through engagement with stakeholders, but we also do the civil service people survey as well, which is a cross civil service survey that runs to all civil servants every year. All the results are online, so everyone can go in and see what the results are. So there are things we might be able to track in there as well. But for me, when you go to someone in a department and say, how does it feel here? If they are shifting their way of responding, that's powerful. And obviously you want to make sure that you do that in a robust way so that you know that's representative for what's happening. So if we're starting to see some of those niggly points disappearing, obviously you can't completely say that that's due to the interventions we do here. It'll be a multi stakeholder and interventionist approach for shifting it, which completely dependent on what happens in local departments, outside in the civil service as a whole. Very tricky, very, very tricky. But I think try and measure it as many different ways as you can and see if there are ways that you both do outputs and impacts as well as whether or not you're doing the things you want to do.
Obviously, you've invested in your master's and your doctorate, but you're also intensely curious. So how do you invest in your own learning and development?
Gosh, I want to say I wish sometimes I want to go back to university and do something more because I love reading. I don't find I give myself that time to do as much of that as I used to. now that I'm no longer responsible for the capable development in the civil service, I can actually attend as a practitioner, as part of. So I'm quite excited of continuing the action learning sets and the book clubs and the intervention that we've got for practitioners across government. That's probably my investment. I've got a stack of books on my bookshelves which I haven't come to, but I'm trying to go through them and then talking to interesting people like yourself on what happens outside of the civil service, so we keep ourselves both sane but also invested in what does the world look like outside government.
Are there any particular books or resources when you look back at your own development that really stand out for you as having that you'd recommend that for people follow up?
I'm trying to think of what Peter War's book was called, but clearly, I think it was just called Work Psychology. And I'd say that gives a landscape, and it's an old book. But Peter War was one of our professors at Sheffield University, so obviously that was one of the textbooks for the occupational psychology masters. What I like about it is takes each of the different areas on work psychology and goes into what the latest thinking is there. The key book in the audience, Linda Holbeck and Mian Chung Judge's book on organization development and the latest iterations of that one. I'd say if I were to start from my OD journey, I'll probably start with those two. I'm reading at the moment on organization design, not surprisingly, on Naomi Stanford's work and trying to figure out how do I bring all of that together and look at the systems level? So it's not just organizations, it's systems design at different levels. But yeah, there's so much out there. So coming back to your question on how do you make sure that why is it with all that knowledge that we can't do it? But maybe it's because it looks big and we just have to start somewhere and get the depth in each of the areas, which is what I like with Ancient Judge's OD app, that you actually get an opportunity to say, actually, what does my profile need to look at this particular time for this particular piece of work and where the strength I need to work on.
One of the things we want this podcast to do is to inspire the next generation of OD practitioners, organization design practitioners coming through. Obviously, we're finding there's no one path, is there? But what advice would you give someone either considering a career, or they could be looking into OD, or they could be in HR looking at OD? Like, what advice would you give to them to help get started?
I'd probably think first on what type of work do you really enjoy doing? If the work you really enjoy doing has to do with being with other people and engaging and working with organizations, then that's probably step one. If, on the other hand, that you're not too interested and curious in how organizations work and the approach you have is probably to stay away from it. I think there's something about your preferences. It doesn't mean you can't go into it, but there's something about thinking about the work that you enjoy doing and making sure that the work fits your own expectations, and then talk to other people who are in the OD space, get a sense of what the work is doing, listen to podcasts, get a sense of what the work might look like and what kind of things might be attractive. I do the OD app profiling as well and say, actually, what are some of the things that I'm good at the moment that I need to build on, and what are some things that might be needed for a role in OD&D that I'm not already developing. And then try and get, it's always hard because I think sometimes OD, we want people to expert before they engage with it because there's so much risk, but sometimes see if there are people you can join when they either talk to clients the first time or observe it. Or if you don't have time to do that or opportunity to do it, just start observing in your organization. If you're already in an organization, you can start looking at how team meetings work. You can see how leaders are operating. You can see how people are engaging. You can see about the relationship they're creating, and you can start doing pattern spotting and seeing what happens in the organization. And that helps you get a tune into what are some of the things I can pay attention to. And it also helps practice you observing at different levels, which is a skill set that you can both hear and see and make sense of in the moment, and that takes training. So you might as well start doing some of that early on. But I'd say take that curiosity with you into your workspace.
A huge thank you, Susanne. It's been a really fascinating conversation. It's also really reassuring to know that there's someone like you working in the way that you do at the heart of government, connecting all the dots and raising standards as well. It's really great to hear. Danny, what are you taking away from our session today?
Lots of things, just a few to pull out. I think your focus on really improving the experience of people being at work and how important that is for our organisations and for individuals working in them, really important. I loved what you said about understanding, when we're starting out, understanding the work that's already going on, the work that's planned, and seeing how what we're thinking is going to fit into that. And the reflection on, is the system actually ready for us to be in there and do the work? kind of balancing that against our own kind of capabilities and interests.
Right. Yeah. And I guess my sort of 3 takeaways, absolutely, exactly, is this knowing when the system is ready or not, which stood out for me. Just in reiterating the importance of a communities of practice and how you need to curate the support according to the needs of the individual and their circumstances as well. And also just like Susanne's method for getting started, like understanding what is and what's working and what needs to be done and where the gaps are, is really fascinating. I just want to say a huge thank you. If people want to reach out to you, or if they want to follow your work, what's the best way for people to do that, Susanne?
They can reach out on LinkedIn. They should be able to find me there fairly under Susanne Gidda. Or
Brilliant.
if they already know me in government, then they can obviously find me in the Cabinet Office.
And probably coming to a conference near you as well, which is really good. Well, thank you so much for your time. We know you're extraordinarily busy. It's been brilliant. I know that a lot of people are going to get a lot of value from it as well. So thank you. Your interview now enters our vault of 36 episodes now with other practitioners from across the world who are all creating meaningful and significant change in their own organization. So thank you. If you're watching this for the first time, we'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button because the algorithm gods really like that. And also, if you want to be up to date with all the latest episodes, we have a new episode that comes out every single Monday on YouTube and on Buzzsprout and all the major audio platforms. Is on, Danny?
Fridays.
If I send the file on time. So please subscribe to keep up to date with it as well. But thanks again for all your time, and thanks again, Susanne. It's been a brilliant conversation.
Thank you for hosting this. I think these conversations just add huge value to the OD colleagues across the world. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you. We really enjoyed it.